remember to expand your screen.
Hi, everyone. We've got a few people joined already. I think we'll just give a couple more minutes for others to connect. Okay, I think we can begin. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the second in our series of 7 webinars on the Bt30 study. My name is Sarah Naika. I'm from the Center of Excellence in Human Development at BIT, and I will chair today's session. To recap, this series covers the research findings and lessons from this remarkable Bt30 cohort study, the largest and longest running population-based cohort on child health and well-being in Africa. The impetus for this series is the launch of a book on the study, which has been authored by Professor Linda Richter. It's titled Bt30, a study as ambitious as the country we wanted to create. The book covers the stories, the science, and the people in the Bt30 study. It's available for purchase from Amazon and Takealot, and we'll give you the links in the chat and on the presentation, as well as on all our social media platforms. So you can purchase the book. All of the proceeds for the book go to a fund specifically for postgraduate students who are conducting research in longitudinal cohorts and using longitudinal data. So today's webinar focuses on the early years of the cohort. As we know, the first 5 years of life are the fastest period of growth and development. And this webinar will cover the early life of Bt30 participants, including their home environment, their early learning, and the factors that influence their development. So joining us today, we have Professor Linda Richter, the author of the Bt30 book and one of the founders of the study. She's a doyen in child development. We're also pleased to have Mastura Sadan. Mastura has been a leader and a pioneer in child-related policy in South Africa and a great supporter of the study itself. I'll introduce the speakers in more detail later. So for today's flow of the session, we'll begin with a presentation on the early years by Linda, followed by Mastura, who weave in the policy perspective. We'll close out with some time for questions and maybe a short discussion at the end. So feel free to post your questions to either speaker in the chat, or you can direct them to us during the Q&A session. So we'll kick off with the first presentation. Professor Richter is a distinguished professor in the DSI-NRF Center of Excellence in Human Development at BIT, with a career that needs a webinar slot of its own. But for the sake of time, in summary, Linda has spent time at the universities of KZN, Harvard, Melbourne, and Oxford. She's been an advisor to WHO, the Global Fund, and many more. She's led the drafting of South Africa's integrated early childhood development policy and the 2017 Lancet series advancing early childhood development from science to scale. And for decades of work in the field, Linda has received the MRC's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015 and the National Research Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021. Prof, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm always slightly befuddled by this technology. Is my screen visible to everyone? Sarah?
Not yet.
Is my screen visible to you?
Not yet.
What have I done? Is it visible to you now, Sarah?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry, everyone, that takes a bit of time. I always find it quite irritating myself having to wait. But good morning, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. As Sarah said, this is really to delve deeper into some of the issues that are covered in the book. Now, just by way of introduction, just give you an overview of the study. It is available on our website, but we started with 3,273 children. We collected 24 rounds of data collection. We collected data from mothers and caregivers, fathers, teachers, specialists, and their teachers and children themselves. And then there were various specialist studies of a smaller scale. For example, on low birth weight, on sleep, on language development, and so on. Birth to 30 is also part of cohorts. Now, cohorts is a consortium of birth cohort studies. There are 5 of them, one in Guatemala, one in Pelotas, Brazil, one in Cebu, one in India, New Delhi, and the Birth to 30. And a lot of research on the Birth to 30 cohort has also involved one or all of the other cohorts. Now, these are very large, varied data sets. There are 22 million data points in Birth to 30, and we've published over 300 scientific papers. The main themes are growth, nutrition and health, learning and education, violence, mental health and social well-being, neighborhoods, schools, and mobility. And the main outcomes that we're examining now that the cohort are adults. The last time we saw them was at 28, but we are planning to see them quite soon. We're looking at health and mental health, education, and economic participation, what we would consider the elements of human development. Now, in the cohorts themselves, we enrolled 22,800 births, and studies in the cohorts, which include adults, we'd have a sample size of close to 11,000. Now, we know from work that's been done by the Early Child Development Countdown Group and by the group working on the global data to advance child development that about 43% of children under 5 in low and middle income countries are at risk of poor development. And analyses of MICS, the multiple indicator cluster surveys of UNICEF, using their ECDI, estimate that about 65% of 4 to 5-year-olds in low and middle income countries are falling behind or are behind in early learning. And more recently, of course, our own Thrive by 5 estimates are also give the sense of that we really urgently need to do something about early child development. Now, my presentation is going to really focus on the quality of early child caregiving and outcomes. Now, we know that better off, nicer, happier early childhoods lead to a greater likelihood of good adult and adolescent outcomes. And we also know that poorer, neglectful, unhappy early childhoods lead to an enhanced likelihood of poor adult and adolescent outcomes. What we don't know, or what we know less about, is which features of these early environments are important, which have the strongest influence on outcomes, for which groups of children, and how do we build on positive features to improve children's development. Now, if we look at data that have come out of the cohorts on which has really emphasized the first 1,000 days, we know that maternal factors, particularly maternal age and height, are associated with a range of outcomes in their children, their birth weight, their growth, and their schooling. We also know that types of birth, for example, preterm birth, is associated with shorter growth to adulthood and less schooling. If we go to the child in infant years, the first 2 years, but not later, this is associated with adult height, schooling, and IQ, and the birth weight of offspring. And we know that weight gain after 2 years, but not before, is associated with increased adult blood pressure. So these findings have been well established starting in 2008 with the first papers that started coming out of the cohorts group, showing a particular cutoff around 2 years of age, particularly sensitive for growth, which indicates that growth during that early time is positively associated with later outcomes, but not after that time. And weight gain, not before 2 years, but after 2 years, is associated with increased adult pressure and other indicators of chronic disease. Now, the significance of the cohort findings have really been quite substantial. Globally, it confirmed the importance of first 1,000 days of life. There had been several studies, particularly from the big cohorts in the Scandinavian countries, the British cohorts, big American follow-up studies, which had shown the significance of the first 1,000 days, but we didn't know how generalizable this was, particularly in low and middle income countries, where there are very different conditions, particularly other things which might interfere, different breastfeeding patterns, much higher levels of adversity, fewer services, and so on. So it confirmed the importance of the first 1,000 days in these long-term birth cohort studies to adulthood in low and middle income countries, and varying by time periods, continents, cultures, and therefore gives us some confidence in the generalizations we make from it. In South Africa, this work was coming out, including from birth to 30, at the time that we were developing the South African Integrated National ECD policy. And it particularly emphasized the importance of the first 1,000 days, the importance of maternal health and well-being, early child nutrition of mother and child, an integrated approach that would address health, education, and social development, and other issues such as sanitation, housing, and so on, and that it should be equitable. Poor and rural children particularly were being left behind. Now, I want to talk particularly about what we call responsive caregiving. Now, we know that the infant is reaching out with a number of innate capabilities, reaching out to learn about the world and to attach themselves to other humans. So we know that human infants have what we call a drive to effectiveness or drive to competence, reaching out to learn about the world they're in, touching it, mouthing it, weighing it, throwing it, and so on. And that they have a number of signals and capacities, particularly the way they look, that promote proximity, care, and affection. And this sets up a system whereby the infant is reaching out to learn from other human beings. And that learning capacity with which they're born is facilitated by opportunities to learn that are given to them, affection and safety for exploration, contingent responsiveness, scaffolding, where adults assist infants to reach their goals, and praise. And this has given rise to this concept of sensitivity and responsiveness, probably made famous by no one else more than Mary Ainsworth. And this establishes the interpersonal understanding of learning. So this period of life is so important because of the establishment of intersubjectivity. Responsive caregiving was really given a lot of emphasis in the Lancet 2017 Lancet series, the 3 papers. And it then gave rise to the Nurturing Care Framework, which, as many of you will know, is a description of 5 sectors that are needed to help children develop their potential: good health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and opportunities to learn. And that this capacity of families to provide these things for the very young child take place within enabling environments which support the nurturing care capacity of parents and other caregivers. Now, the research since the Lancet series, since the origin, the work of cohorts has really accelerated so fast that in 2021, last year, the World Health Organization published a set of guidelines based on very careful reviews of the literature in which they advised that children, in order to promote early child development, children need responsive caregiving. We need to promote their early learning. We need to integrate caregiving and nutrition interventions and support maternal mental health. And many countries around the world are taking up these guidelines within health programs, within social protection programs, early education programs, and so on. Now, I'm going to talk about two studies in Birth to 30, looking at measuring responsive caregiving early in life and following up children and looking at outcomes at 5 and 15 years. So the first is to look at cognitive performance at 5 years, and the second was to look at IQ and physical growth at 15 years. And I'll talk about each of these studies in turn. So how do we measure caregiving in infancy? We have used a composite score based on observations of mother-infant interactions to code maternal responsiveness. And these were based on work that was done on the home inventory and work by Clark Stewart, in which you rate positive attitude towards the child, physical contact, loving and encouraging speech, response to children's distress, response to communicate their communication, and response to their physical needs. And cognitive stimulation, we also used a composite score in response to 5 questions that also come from the home environment, on which I had done a lot of research some 10 or 15 years before that. So that looks at things like, do people have books in the house? Do they read them? Do people read books or show children pictures, make or buy things, toys for the child, take the child out to shops and visits and try to teach the child anything? And we created a latent variable, which was a broader concept of quality of care, childcare at the home, as a combination of maternal responsiveness and early learning. At 5 years, we measured the performance of children on 32 items from a developmental questionnaire, which we had previously validated. We controlled for sex, maternal schooling, socioeconomic status, and height 2. We had 856 children with complete data from infancy, looking at childcare quality and 5-year outcome. And we wanted to look at whether these effects were differentiated by children from different socioeconomic conditions. Now, what we found was that the quality of early childcare is associated with cognitive performance at preschool age, so that with greater cognitive stimulation and greater maternal responsiveness, we had higher Denver scores. There was a clear SES gradient in quality of care. The lowest quality of care is found amongst the poorest groups, where 41% of children were getting poor quality care. Only 23% of children received poor quality of care in the intermediate group and 14% in the higher group. So children from the poorest SES homes were exposed to the lowest levels of maternal responsiveness and cognitive stimulation. All the other covariates, maternal education, growth, gender, also positively associated with Denver scores at 5. So we had to adjust for those in the analysis, but still found that cognitive stimulation and maternal responsiveness remain associated with cognition at 5. But there's a stronger association between cognitive stimulation and cognition than maternal responsiveness. So it seemed that cognitive development at 5 very dependent on cognitive stimulation. But we also found that there was this very strong role of socioeconomic status. There was a 3-point difference in the mean scores, the Denver scores between children in high and low SES households. Maternal responsiveness, cognitive stimulation, and quality of care for children in the intermediate and high SES groups wasn't significantly associated with 5-year cognition, meaning that people in the high SES group, it really didn't matter because there was very little variation in the maternal responsiveness and cognitive stimulation. They were offering high levels of those. But maternal responsiveness was positively associated with 5-year cognition amongst children in the lowest SES groups, and cognitive stimulation was positively associated with 5-year cognition, even amongst the poorest children after adjustment. And children in the low SES group who received high quality childcare in the home scored 2 points higher at 5 years on cognition scores, on a cognition test. So our conclusions were most children under 2 are cared for at home by a mother or caregiver. Almost 2/3 of mothers are highly responsive to their young children. On average, nearly 60% of mothers scored high on responsiveness, but less than 1/3 provided high levels of cognitive stimulation. And our conclusions from this was that it's important to improve household SES, maternal education, and child growth in the first 2 years to boost preschool learning and school readiness. That we need to target the poorest households with least educated mothers and children with growth faltering. We need to increase cognitive stimulation in home to improve the cognitive performance of the poorest children, and that we could build on the high responsiveness, the emotional responsiveness of mothers, that this could be a really important platform on which to develop cognitive stimulation. Now, a second study looked at early learning and responsiveness and adolescent outcomes. And for this study, we actually published results from 2 cohorts, the South African cohort and the 1982 Pilates cohort. But I'm only going to speak about the South African results because we analyzed the data separately. We examined the extent to which early learning and responsiveness moderated the effect of adversity on adolescent cognitive performance, which we measured by the Ravens, and psychosocial well-being, as well as height. We looked at children between 14 and 16 years of age in South Africa. We had a sample size of over 1,000. The adversity index was, perhaps it's easier to show you on a diagram. So we looked at environmental adversities and child adversities, and they classified the environmental adversities as household wealth, crowding, maternal schooling, height, maternal age, and maternal mental health, and child adversities as birth weight, gestational age, and height. And our assumption was that nurturing care in the home would moderate these effects on later human capital in adolescence. What we did in fact find is that higher cumulative adversities predicted lower adolescent human capital, at least in terms of adolescent IQ, and lower adolescent height, and that they ameliorated the impacts of adversities with higher adolescent IQ and higher adolescent height. There was no effect on psychosocial adjustment in Bt30 or Pilates, and we remain with questions as to whether the measures we used, which were the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire in Pilates and Achenbach's Youth Self-Report in Bt30, were suitable instruments for the population, and whether we were correctly measuring what we were calling internalizing and externalizing behavior, and we are revisiting that question now. So the conclusions for that were that cumulative adversities have long-term effects on physical and mental health and well-being. We've looked at 5 and 15 years. That early responsive caregiving and learning opportunities are positively associated with adolescent human capital, even if you adjust for early adversities. And that a nurturing early home environment mitigates the negative effects of early cumulative adversities on adolescent IQ and height. And in high nurturing environments, you find no differences in IQ by cumulative adversities. So nurturing care provides the protective mechanisms that enable children to learn and develop in spite of early adversities. Now, our takeaway from these 2 studies is from this only large-scale population-based long-term study of children in South Africa, which demonstrates the harm of adversity on preschool and adolescent growth and cognitive development, particularly poverty, at least as indexed by our socioeconomic measure, which was assets. Nurturing care at home in the first 2 years of life, which we defined as maternal responsiveness and early learning opportunities, can ameliorate the impact of adversity, especially in the poorest households with less educated mothers. So we acknowledge all the funders of the study. There were many more than these shown on the slide, but these were our main funders. And as Sarah showed you before, the book is available on Amazon, Smashwords, and Takealot. And that's it from me. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Prof. I think in the interest of time, we'll hand over to Mastura. Mastura Sadan is a social policy analyst with particular expertise in poverty and inequality. Currently, Mastura is the chief sector expert in the National Planning Commission Secretariat in the presidency. Until 2018, Mastura was the program manager for the program to support pro-poor policy development in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, where she also managed NIS. And for those of us in the field, we know wherever there are strides made in improving the lives of children in South Africa, Mastura's imprint is there. Mastura, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. So my presentation is in three parts. Firstly, I'll look at some of the macro issues that provide, in a sense, the context for policy making. And then I'll look at the birth to 30 and longitudinal studies more generally. And you will have to excuse me, I might call it birth to 20, because that's how I learned about this cohort study. So, and then thirdly, to looking at how do we make the early years a priority in policy in South Africa. Now, given when birth to 30 started, it really tells the fine-grained story of child development in the post-apartheid period. But I also want to say, having read parts of the book, the shadow of history is long. And that really, that's from Colin Bundy, that's not my original thought. But it really, for me, in a way, showed the importance of understanding child development over the long term. And later on, I'll speak about some of the challenges we face as policymakers in South Africa. So just to look at the macro issues, and here I call these the shaping forces or context that I had spoken about earlier. And when one thinks back to 1994, which now seems like a long distant memory for most of us, is that what we inherited was the kind of country that we inherited with these structural features of both the economy and society, which was, of course, hugely distorted. And there were high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And of course, in the post-apartheid period, we've seen a continuation of this. In the 2000s, the mid-2000s, we did see some reduction in poverty, and then also by about 2008 or so, some reduction in inequality. But of course, it has been unemployment that has increased significantly again in the post-apartheid period. There was some improvements again in the 2000s, given the rate of growth, etc. But generally, it's not a good story that we can tell. So just in terms of historically, some of the domestic factors, of course, as I mentioned, our history, demography. In 1994, we were, in typically that kind of pyramid in demographic terms, a very large young population. We are starting to have an aging population, but of course, we also have that large bulge of young people. And then, of course, also the country's level of human development at the time. Now, if one looks more recently at some of the global shaping forces, of course, we've seen, financial crises, the 2008, and of course, before that, 1998. The issue that's top of mind for everyone is climate change. And then, of course, also rapid technological change. and then pandemics. And I looked at Colin Bundy's book, and he was talking about pandemics, and I thought, but when was this book published? But actually, he was talking about HIV, and I think, you know, because there's so many things happening, one almost forgets some of these things. And of course, in many ways, these structural forces sets the parameters. But of course, it's not destiny. So we have choices in these matters as well. And so just a quick kind of overview of the kind of periods of policymaking in the post-apartheid period. You know, there was to start off with 1994, there's the Mandela and Mbeki era. It's the kind of first decade and a half. And I think, you know, that was also a time when there was a lot of positive energy in the country, and you know, there were a lot of new policies, but there was also a sense of possibilities, you know, that we could, in a way, remake our country. And of course, then subsequently, we've had the Zuma era, and of course, we had former President Motlanthe for that short period of time. And then 2018 to the current period, we have President Ramaphosa. Now, policymaking, of course, is about politics, it's about policy choices, and it's about state capacity. Of course, there are many other factors, funding being you know, another one of them. But I thought we have to remember these things, that in an ideal kind of world, you know, one almost wants to discard some of these issues, but these are very real issues we have to consider. Then just looking at the Birth to 30 study, and as I said earlier, I was introduced to it when it was the Birth to 20 study. So we have to think about this as it plays out against this backdrop of this country, you know, this country with all these possibilities, but of course with many of these structural factors that hinder progress, and very importantly, some of the policy choices we've made in this democratic period. And then, you know, I've asked myself the question, so why are longitudinal studies important? And partly it's, I suppose, you know, it's this issue of the short-termism that not only we suffer from in this country, it's a kind of general challenge, I suppose, across the world. But I think what's important is that these birth or cohort studies shows us the value of the life course approach. And Linda, here I want to say that I think in this area, we need to do a lot more advocacy and education on this issue. And as I had said earlier, Birth to 20 tracks the first generation of young people born in a democratic South Africa. And of course, tells the story in a very fine-grained way. And as Linda had spoken about, of course, it has contributed to, the breadth of studies has contributed to knowledge. Now, as Sarah had mentioned, you know, I managed the National Income Dynamic Study for the presidency and then for DPME, and worked very closely with my colleagues at UCT. So I had a front seat to the challenges of longitudinal studies with the NIDS, that is. And again, you know, this study in particular provides, it answers important questions about childhood and child development outcomes. But of course, we know that longitudinal studies take time to produce results. And I think particularly for people in government, there's an impatience about, you know, we want to know information and we want to know it now. And often, in my view, in a far too simplistic a manner. It, of course, is very expensive and time consuming. And I think that the most important ingredient really here is about vision and leadership, because it is about thinking about the long term. And then, of course, you require research infrastructure. And here, institutions and people are very important. And again, if I might say, I think, you know, for many of my colleagues in government, there isn't an appreciation of this. I mean, just to think back to during COVID, when the NIDS CRAM study was being run, and the very valuable data that we got from that, if there hadn't been a NIDS, we wouldn't have been able to do NIDS cram. So that really is my point. And then, well, I said that vision and leadership was the most important thing, but I would imagine even more important is commitment and tenacity. Because unless you have that, you shouldn't be undertaking any kind of longitudinal study. So just to move quickly onto the policy engagement issues, and here, you know, again, I think Linda plays a particularly important role here, in that not only is she an internationally, you know, widely acclaimed academic, but she's also a public intellectual. And I think that's a really important contribution. And Linda in the book notes that, you know, no one study results in a major policy change unless it's corroborated by other studies. So yes, you know, it's about on balance of evidence, and far too often we find, you know, results being, or findings being produced, and then, you know, often politicians think that that's the one important study, and we must now use this information and nothing else matters. But I think the other important thing, and yeah, I'm probably going to contradict myself a little bit, is that policy change is incremental. So some of us would like to think that, you know, we make a significant difference in, you know, just in one instance, but actually it really is about time. But very importantly, there's also, sometimes there are policy moments where factors align. And here I think, you know, Linda with a very long experience knows that it's in these moments when you have the evidence, that the evidence in a way really comes into its own. And you know, Linda has spoken about some of the policy successes, and in the book she talks about the contribution to the age expansion of the child support grant, the National Integrated Early Childhood Development policy, and then of course the Lancet ECD series. Now, for those of us in government, the challenges really are that in an ideal world, we should be thinking long term and then acting in the short to medium term. For example, you know, Linda has spoken about the first 1,000 days. You know, children who are born in this year or who were born in 2012, when the NDP, for example, was adopted, will be 18 in 2030. Children don't have time for us to kind of, you know, what is the word, just pontificate and not act. And one of the limitations of democracy, of course, is that we operate in these 5-year electoral cycles. And one of the things that that you should have in a government is that there should be an entity or entities, both inside and outside government, that can strategize and plan over the long term. We, of course, now have the National Planning Commission, and that might be an issue that we could even talk about. But, you know, in government, we deal with social issues in an episodic manner, often divorced from the economy and the wider structural forces at play. And child development, in my view, unfortunately, is also dealt with in this manner. It seems as if we are talking about a series of separate parts or events with no connection between them, no connection to what happened before, or no connection to what will happen in the future. And I'm going to talk about early childhood development later on. But I mean, you know, the kind of challenge of different departments working together is emblematic of this problem. But even within a department, you know, you would swear that these people aren't working with the same children. And then, you know, the challenge that we always have, which is the limited capacity and time for government officials to engage with research. Now, just in terms of, you know, some of the dominant policy narratives, and in South Africa, we have this where everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people will say, oh, we've got good policy, or even we've got the best policies, but we just fail miserably at implementation, and we don't, you know, there's this kind of lack of implementation, which I really find really frustrating. That might be true to some extent, but in my view, policy is aspirational, and anybody who has ever tried to implement anything knows that it's very challenging. And also what has happened though over the last decade is that the bureaucracy has become weaker, significantly so, unfortunately. And of course, we know that we've had corruption and still, unfortunately, have very high levels of corruption. But there's also been some positives, the advances in digital platforms for service provision, the social relief of distress grant being a case in point. I am, of course, well aware of some of the challenges in terms of exclusions, and that might be, again, this issue about if one looks forward, how one deals with some of these challenges. And then we, of course, have the National Development Plan, which was adopted in 2012. But before we published the NDP, the first NPC that had written this, in my view, very important document, which was called the NPC Diagnostic. And unfortunately, many of the issues that were raised way back in 2010 are still valid today, many of the challenges that was identified in that diagnostic document. But I suppose the important contribution that the NDP makes is about that it's forward-looking. And for the first time, we have a plan. Of course, we can talk about some of the issues around the proposals and the implementation. So now just the last part of my presentation, which is about making the early years a priority. And I look at both the child support grant and the early childhood development. Now you might say, but surely the early years are a priority in government. And it is to some extent, and to some extent we pay also some lip service to this. But so when I was preparing this presentation, one of my slides were about successes, and of course and then I thought, should it be plural or singular? And the child support grant has, of course, been the major policy success in the democratic period. The CSG was, of course, introduced in 1998 at 100 Rand for children up to 6 years of age. And the objective of the CSG was to ensure that primary caregivers of children in poverty are able to provide for their basic needs. We saw some policy reform in the 2000s with the age extension. There was debates around conditions or not to condition. And in my view, very importantly, we had institutional reform, which was, of course, the introduction of SASSA and the technological advances that SASSA used. And again, that's an issue that I think needs further discussion. And so the CSG was, of course, quite successful. I'll speak about some of the challenges that we are still experiencing. But in my view, part of the reason why it was and it remained so successful is that there was an institutional infrastructure to deliver grants. Admittedly, it was racially targeted and it was, to a limited number of people. But in a sense, there was an institutional infrastructure that one could build on. There was, of course, capacity in that there were people who had worked in the system and knew how to do these kinds of things. And then also, the CSG was initially phased in over a 5-year period. I was one of the people at the time who was very critical of this, because given the high levels of child poverty, everybody needed to have it as quickly as possible. But, the benefit of hindsight tells one that, you need to build your capacity over time. There was, of course, a conditional grant that was allocated also to assist with the implementation. And there was political support and committed officials. But there was and there remains, of course, this discourse on dependency. And that is largely, in my view, about gender and power and so on. And so which challenges remain? Yesterday, I was at the launch of a report that UNICEF did for the Department of Social Development. And of course, we know that access for young children 0 to 1 years remains a challenge. Now, in South Africa, our take-up rates for child grants and grants in general are, well, maybe not for the disability grant, are generally quite high. 80-odd% in 2019 for the child support grant. But of course, for young children, this has always been a challenge. And this is a long-standing challenge. It's not a new one. The evidence that Linda has presented, but also lots of other evidence tell us, of course, that early receipt is really important in terms of benefits. Now, there, of course, were lots of challenges. There was the risk of state capture and the potential collapse of the whole system. And then currently there are issues around the contracts. There's anecdotal evidence of abuse by some retailers where they force people to spend a portion of their money at their particular shop. And then there's also the capacity on the side of the agency, SASSA, and then DSD, in terms of, when a contract is being written and agreed to, that we need to make sure that issues around data ownership and protection is airtight. And then, of course, there's also the issue of the value of the CSG. It is at a relatively low value at 480 Rand. Now, just moving on quickly, I'm aware of the time, Sarah. In terms of the National Development Plan and the ECD proposals, of course, the goal by 2030 is universal access to early childhood development. And we make a number of proposals in the NDP. And very importantly, an issue that I think should be up for discussion is this 2 years compulsory ECD for grade R and RR. If we are talking about the first 1,000 days being really important, of course, RR and R are also important, but given the limited capacity within the system and the limited resources in terms of funding, where should we be focusing on? And so the question I ask, are these proposals still relevant? We've got the new policy, well, it's not new any longer, but in 2015, we've had the function shift as of 1 April. But, shockingly, for 3 to 4 year olds, there was no real increase in access between 2012 and 2018. Of course, one of the big successes is that grade R is near universal, but of course, there are quality issues. So these are some of the gaps that was identified in the diagnostic, again, that process that Linda led. And so some of the gaps are around the institutional arrangements, that even though access to health services has increased over time, the quality remains poor. The main gap is around support for maternal mental health and parental and caregiver support more generally, the exclusion of very poor children, and of course, as the Thrive by 5 findings have shown us, that the quality remains poor. So now that we've had this function shift from DSD to DBE, this presents an opportunity for us. There has been very limited translation of the policy into the current service delivery model. Of course, not even looking at what the gaps are. There is, of course, the risk that the focus will remain on the ECD center-based component, and that the insufficient focus will be on the first 1,000 days. And so the question is, again, so what do we need to do? Yeah, we need to, I would propose, develop a strategy to implement the policy, and that DBE should lead and build the ECD system, which includes all components, including the first 1,000 days. Over time, of course, that there should be a focus on the first 1,000 days, and we should be improving both quality and access across the system. But that very importantly, we need to have the appropriate capacity at both national and provincial departments. And so if we were to do all of these things, that by 2030, and to achieve our goal by 2030, you'd see there that I've added in universal access to comprehensive quality ECD. And that if we achieve this, we should be achieving improved child outcomes, improved education and labor market outcomes, increased women's labor market participation rate. In the short to medium term, we'd have an effect on reducing poverty, and over the medium to long term, we'd be reducing inequality. So that, of course, is the challenge to us. And so, Linda, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dura. We've got one question in the chat. I'm going to pose that question to you, Prof, while we wait to see if anybody else has any questions or comments. If you do, you can put them into the chat function or raise your hand with the function at the bottom. Just raise your hand and I'll come to you. We have about 10 minutes left. We've got load shedding starting at 2 p.m., so we've got to be on the dot. So Prof, while you consider this, everybody else, you can just add in your comments or raise your hand. So this is from Dory. Dory asked, what else have we learned about or from the cohort studies about the independent predictors or correlates, other than SES, of maternal responsiveness, cognitive stimulation, and the quality of care?
Yeah, thanks, Dory. We tried to look at this in a number of ways, and I see Mark, you're on the webinar, so that's nice. Mark Walken and I did two analyses that I think are very interesting in the sense that it tries to, Mark used structural equation modeling to try and understand kind of the progressive, we think of one thing causing something, but in fact there are causes which become effects and effects become causes. So in one of the papers we looked at, well, what were predictors of poor birth weight? And birth weight is predictive of a lot of things later on, but in fact there are kind of maternal capacities that are highly predictive of birth weight, such as maternal age and maternal height. If we stretched past birth weight to the first 2 years of growth, we found that it was socioeconomic indicators, particularly assets in the household, which predicted growth. But if we looked at child development, it was very much more predicted by paternal and maternal education. So it's hard to say there's one thing. Of course, all of this clusters together. The worst deal is to be a poor young woman, probably without a male partner to assist, no certain income or income security, bar the grant, dependent on others in a household. It's a collection of things that seem to weigh so heavily on her potential to be emotionally nurturant and to provide learning opportunities. They're often stressed and demoralized, if not outright depressed, and subject to interpersonal violence. So it's I think we've tried to bite, this thing about how do you digest an elephant? You bite little bits at a time. Unfortunately, the data is so expansive in a way, but also so shallow. Almost everything that I want to go down into deeper in the data, remembering that it's primarily an epidemiological study, so not a great deal of depth. Like if you look at our measures of maternal emotional responsiveness and cognitive stimulation, very simplistic. So the study doesn't afford us depth of analysis, but it does afford us the breadth and, as Mistura said, the life course approach that, given that it was longitudinal, this perspective, we are able to identify factors prior to outcomes. So, Dory, I would suggest looking at those two papers with Mark. I think they're very helpful. Mark, you're on, and Sarah could give you speaking rights, I think, if you wanted to add anything to that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit. Sarah, can you give Mark? Oh, here he is. Okay.
Thanks very much, Linda, and pleased to add my compliments both to the presenter and the discussant for really laying out and opening up the issues. My answer is best to say that I popped into the chat these citations to the two articles that Linda has mentioned, and people can follow them up there. Basically, what Linda encouraged as a social psychologist working with epidemiologists was to take a couple of attempts with me as a sociologist to bring the what has been called now the structural factors into center stage as predictors rather than as controls. And the result was these two papers, in particular the second one, has a disadvantage, namely that our outcome changes between sort of post-infancy and young childhood. Nevertheless, we show that as you move up the age scale with those outcomes in mind, these social factors become increasingly important as compared to the inherited factors. And people could follow that up in the papers.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Prof, another question from Nicola, I think for your presentation. How was child growth defined?
Throughout the study, Nicola, we've measured growth comprehensively. I mean, not only height and weight, but head circumference, fat, body composition, in fact, as well, looking at fat mass and lean mass and so on. But in these studies, we're defining growth as length under 1 year and under 2 years, and height 2 years and above, and converted to Z scores according to the WHO median for that age and sex. So if I don't refer specifically to weight, that, for example, one of the strong findings from cohorts is that weight gain after 2 years is predictive of obesity, but weight gain prior to 2 years, which relates to catch-up growth from lower birth weight, is not related to obesity. But if I don't refer specifically to weight, I've referred to height or length. But we tended to measure height at 2 years as our primary measure of early growth, and that has been in terms of height.
Thank you. Another one from Kaylee. I'm keen to know from both speakers what they think we should focus on for future research. I was also interested in the household crowding variable, how that was measured, and was it hypothesized to be a negative thing?
Okay, do you want me to answer that?
Mastura, do you want to say anything about the future research, and then Prof, you can close off?
Yes, maybe to say, you know, in terms of my relationship with Linda, we've worked quite closely on some research studies over the last few years. And I think the important issue of also getting policymakers to raise what some of the issues are, what are the issues that are important for them, and producing, of course, you know, researchers are not the handmaidens of government officials, but to undertake research that's also policy relevant, but also, as Linda has said, you know, in the communication with policymakers, it's very important. And a friend of mine has taught me an important lesson. You know, sometimes some of these issues are quite complex, and I was speaking about this challenge of not thinking long term, is that, you know, we should be telling more stories and showing the connections between things in that way. And I think that will help us. Again, it's not about making things, you know, overly simplistic, but because, you know, I also don't want us to think about policymakers as kind of dancers, but really engaging people, because just given the demands on our time, one has to be quite strategic. Thanks.
Okay.
Kaylee was asking about household crowding. I think, Kaylee, in all our studies on Bt30, household crowding is defined in our demographic data set as people per room. And because that is quite a large proportion in many of the households in the study, we did classify us as a negative thing. And there's in fact quite a lot of research indicating that high density households are noisier, more distracting, that they disturb people's sleep, for example. I published a paper many years ago on household crowding and child development. But recently there's a real interest in the degree of things going on in a household as a stress for people. So not only is it a stress that you're having to sleep in the same room as people eat or cook, that means you've got to wake up early and get out of the way, and all of the sort of domestic thing about that. But the noise levels are very high. There often are less attention given individually to small children. So yes, we did define it as a negative, higher levels of household crowding.
Thank you. We've got two more questions, one from Dory and one from Daniela. We've got a few seconds left, I think, before the load shedding hits. I think what we want to do now is probably thank the presenters and all of you for attending. I will pop those questions in when we share this to our social media on Twitter. I'll add in those questions, and Linda and Mastura can both respond, and we can continue this conversation indefinitely over Twitter and social media, and just share the webinar recording as well. Thank you all for being here. Prof and Mastura, do you want to say a final goodbye?
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, thanks very much, Daniela, for your question. And thank you so much, Mastura. Daniela, there's actually a lot of work going on, a lot of approaches at community level, and especially through health systems for the well child visit, the routine preventive health services as platforms for encouraging responsive caregiving. I think we put a lot of emphasis on responsive caregiving, and our
Cool. Okay, bye everyone. I think the load shedding has taken effect at Wits. Bye.